Professor Jonathan Matheson, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Right now, there is someone somewhere who just read the title of our episode today, and he got extremely triggered. And he is currently going into the comment section and wants to tell us how he feels about us. What would you tell them directly?
Yeah, there's something I think a little funny about the title of the book. Like on one hand, it is a little provocative and it can get someone angry or heated up. But on the other hand, there's something really commonsensical about it as well. So, I mean, I think as I was writing the book, I kind of went back and forth between, ooh, this sounds really edgy and this sounds so boring and obvious. I kind of went back and forth. So, I mean, I think if they're kind of engaged and listening because they were provoked by the title, that's great. And I think that's part of the reason to get people to read the book or to have the conversation. I would just say I'm not against thinking for yourself. So, I mean, I think it's a wonderful, good thing, and I would recommend it to everyone. So it really is a more modest conclusion that it's just okay not to. So the main goal is just to kind of prevent this kind of criticism of people who don't think for themselves on some topic, even if it'd be better if they did.
When I read the title of the book, I actually got triggered in a way, but this is this kind of triggering that just excites me. And I was first thinking that it's very weird from a philosopher to have this opinion. And then I was thinking, how the hell is he going to argue for that and justify it? So I think the triggering is good. Then there is our reaction to the triggering. And I think many people that are interested in philosophical questions or just thinking about their beliefs, it's something that we're always a bit weirdly curious about things that really challenge us. So I see it like this.
Yeah, I mean, that if, the masterclass troll job would be to get people to think for themselves about the book because the book says it's okay not to, right? So, I mean, I think that would be kind of a great thing about it. I mean, I think it's one of the fun topics to think about whether we have this obligation to think for ourselves. So, good. I'm glad it drew you in, and we can have this conversation as well.
Awesome. So the thesis is basically it's okay not to think for yourself, but let's be philosophical about it and try to define a bit the terms that there is. So I have 4 terms that I would like to understand better. The first one is thinking for yourself. The second one is what is okay. The third one is experts, and the fourth one, consensus. So just you can go one after the other. I can remind you if you forget, but those are things that I think make the thesis.
Yeah, all important parts to the books. So I mean, I think let's start with thinking for yourself. So I mean, I think it is good to get clear on what that is, and I think at least the way maybe that takes away some of the sting of the title when we get clear on what I at least mean by thinking for yourself. So when I'm thinking of thinking for yourself, I'm thinking about getting the evidence yourself and evaluating that evidence yourself. So you're looking at the evidence and you're making your evaluation of what that evidence supports. So I think that maybe the best way to understand that is to contrast that with deference. And so the way I'm thinking about deference is when you defer to someone else, you're believing it because they say so. So maybe you have good reasons to trust them. Maybe they are an expert. We'll talk about that in a second. But the reason why you believe it is because they said so. So you're taking their word for it. So that's where I'm contrasting with thinking for yourself. We think for yourself when you're not just taking anyone's word for it, but you want to see the reasons and you want to evaluate those reasons for yourself. One quick thing just add to that is, I mean, I don't think those two camps, deference and think for yourself, are like fully, you're doing all of one or all of the others. So there's lots of kind of in between mixed bag kind of cases where you're doing perhaps a little bit of both. But that's how I'm thinking of think for yourself. Like you're getting the evidence and you're digging into it. You're making your best of what you can of the evidence. Okay, so that's thinking for yourself. It's okay. I really just mean like there's no problem. So you haven't done anything wrong. And in particular, I'm thinking like intellectually wrong or epistemically wrong. So, as an epistemic agent, I think we have these goals of believing truths and not believing falsehoods, and that's kind of sets our intellectual agenda, so to speak. And there's things that we can do that get in the way of that and that are problematic. Having beliefs that are unsupported by the evidence, is not okay in that sense. But here I'm saying that this is permissible. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I think maybe this will come up later too. That's not to say that it's the best. So I do think that that it is better to think for yourself, and that there are intellectual goods that you can only get by thinking for yourself, and that there are good things to get. It's just okay not to do that. So, part of the view in the book is that it's okay to do less than the best. And as long as you're doing good enough, and that you can do good enough intellectually speaking, even by not thinking for yourself. Okay, good. So that's okay. Then it's the expert question. The expert question is a tough one. And, I try to wrestle a little bit with what counts as an expert. And I think that's a hard thing, and different people in the literature have different views about that. And while I do use the term expert and expertise a lot, what I really care about the most, I guess, is people who are in a better epistemic position than you are. And so, when we talk about experts, it's easy to think like there's some line, and once you meet this bar, you become an expert, and anyone short of that bar, you're not an expert. And that opens up questions about where is that bar, and what does it take to cross that line and become an expert. And those are all, I think, good and important questions. But in some sense, I think the project works even without, getting that exactly set up or being explicit about what exactly it counts to be an expert. The basic idea is that, when it comes to answering a question, we're not all equally good at answering questions, right? So some people are better positioned to answer the question, meaning that they're more likely to get a right answer. And so I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. It has to do with what kind of evidence they have, how much or how good of quality their evidence is, how good they are at evaluating that evidence, what kind of skills in sifting through the evidence, reasoning on the basis of that evidence, what kind of intellectual virtues they have, whether they're open-minded and careful, whether they've thought about it for a long time, or it's the first that they've thought about this question. So I think there are a lot of factors that go into your epistemic position, or how likely you are to answer a question. And so what I think really matters is that when it comes to answering a question, we can almost always find someone who's better than us at answering that question. So someone who, we may put it back in expertise terms, someone who has more expertise than we do. They have more evidence than we do. They're better at thinking through that evidence than we are. One kind of image or analogy that I think about is, if you're at a trivia night with a bunch of friends, given the topic that comes up, there might be different friends that you might want to rely on more heavily than others, because they're better at answering questions on that topic than you are, than other people in the table are. Again, whether or not they count as like an expert in whatever that that field is may not matter as much, in terms of like, if you wanted to get the answer right, you have more reason to trust some people than others, and including yourself in questions like that.
So based on the definition, the expertise doesn't come from any type of certification. So it could be the case, if you define it this way, it's more someone has more knowledge than someone else. That could be, for example, let's talk about ethics. If everybody in ethics is a moral realist and they believe there is objective values about ethics, and then this compose the experts, all the professor of philosophy believes this. And then there is a random dude like Nietzsche that comes and then he says, well, I don't think that ethics, there is any moral values. This is something a society created and so on. Actually, even if he's just a random guy in his mountains, that was not the case of Nietzsche, but even if that was the case, he would be the expert on the topic, because actually he's more connected to the truth rather than the people that are certified, right?
Yeah, I think that, right. I think that could be. I mean, I don't want to say that certification is meaningless. I mean, I don't think that's what makes you an expert, but I do think that can be one of the indicators of expertise, right? So we rely on certification in various ways as a kind of marker of expertise. It's a fallible marker. And so, someone who gets certified as an expert in some domain may not actually be an expert. And in the case, like you mentioned, someone who's not, doesn't have the official credential of, the credentials of some discipline, may nevertheless be an expert, even if we can't recognize that they are an expert or recognize that they have insights that the rest of the discipline or the rest of the people in the domain are lacking. So yeah, no, I think that's right.
So I guess it's, when I read the book, at some point I was like, it really depends on what we mean by the experts. And I think it's for me, there was an important clarification to see this because we could basically rephrase the thesis as it's okay to trust someone who knows more about a topic, right? Mm-hmm. And then actually now that it's defined, it's not simply that if I know a bit more than you do about tea, drinking tea, that you should fully trust me. There is a bit more behind. So how do you structure with the argument? How do you set it up then to make it work for people?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of what helped my thinking about the topic was like an analogy with home projects, right? And so thinking about upkeeping your home, whether it's, whether you encounter an electrical problem or a plumbing problem, or you're trying to get your yard all put together in the right way. For almost all of those projects, there might be things that I can do. Honestly, for me, there's not a lot that I can do in those domains. But for almost all those projects, I can find someone who is better at doing those things than I am. Someone who's more reliable, who's more likely to get the project done well than I am. And so, I mean, the part of the sort of the motivation for the project was that, well, you could have your physical house in order, even if you're outsourcing these different projects, your plumbing projects, electrical projects, yard projects. And I think the same is true of our intellectual house. Our intellectual house can be in order. We have lots of different intellectual projects, lots of different questions that we want to answer. But in a parallel way, for almost all those questions, we can identify someone who's going to be better at answering that question than we are, someone who's more likely to get to the truth than we are. And so there's at least nothing wrong with outsourcing those intellectual projects, I want to say, to those people who are better capable. Again, it could be that you are a do-it-yourself kind of person and you'd rather take on the project yourself. And I think there's nothing wrong with that either. And in fact, there can be plenty of good things that come along with that. And there could be bonus reasons to recommend doing that. But there's just nothing, again, this is the thesis, there's nothing wrong with if you're going to outsource those projects. And in fact, outsourcing those projects fits well with your intellectual goals of believing truth and not believing false. So it's like, if you want to get the answer right, it's not out of laziness that you're deferring to other people, but it's out of your care for the truth. You want to get it right. And it's because you want to get it right that you're relying on other people who are better positioned on the questions than you are.
I see how it works now with individuals. For example, a plumber or someone that takes care of your house. How does that connect on topics such as climate change? What should I believe about climate change? Is it caused by humans or not? Where do we find those experts?
Yeah, good. So often it's not a kind of one-off question where there's one other person. Often there's like a whole group of experts, or there's a whole field of people who have been thinking about questions like this. And part of my view here builds on previous work of mine in the epistemology of disagreement and thinking about what we should do when we know about people who disagree or are faced with disagreement, and especially disagreement amongst the experts. And so, my view on questions like that, where there's not just one person to go to, there's a whole field who are thinking about it, is that your beliefs should align with the expert consensus. And so that can go a bunch of different ways. So, in the case of climate change, the climate scientists have like an overwhelming consensus amongst themselves. And so I think the rational thing to do is to believe in line with them. And again, you can do that. That's the rational thing to believe, whether or not you've engaged in the research yourself or not. So, I mean, part of the view is, if you want to engage in that research, again, that's a great thing to do, but it's not going to change what you're justified in believing, right? Once you know that the expert community has this strong consensus. If you look at the various kinds of data and you don't see things in line with what the expert community does, well, that's just a good reason to think that you're not very good at evaluating this evidence, right? They're experts. They've been doing this kind of thing, for a long time. They have a certain set of skills. I wouldn't know what I'm doing if looking at all this different climate data. I wouldn't know how to evaluate the different charts and graphs and to synthesize this information. And so, my own research on the topic isn't going to change, I think, what's rational for me to believe. And so that's one reason why I'm not required to do it. It's not going to change anything. I should believe in line with the experts. I mean, of course, the expert community isn't always so nicely aligned, right? So one reason why the climate science example works so nicely is it's one of those questions where there is kind of an overwhelming consensus amongst the experts. Lots of things aren't like that, right? Lots of interesting questions have really diverse expert opinions where there is no consensus view, whether it's about the nature of the quantum world or its political matters or philosophical or ethical issues. Usually we find expert opinions really, really spread out and diverse. And in cases like that, my view is that we should be suspending judgment. So basically the idea is if the experts collectively can't answer this question in some sort of like consensus way, then me as a non-expert doesn't really get to have a rational belief on the topic either. So again, like if, the expert quantum physicist can't figure out the nature of the quantum world, it seems a little strange to think like, well, I'm going to do my own research here and I'm going to look at some of the data and I am going to come to a conclusion. I mean, I might do that, but I would have good reason to not trust my conclusion on that issue, given again, the unlikelihood of me evaluating that evidence correctly. Again, in contrast to those people who have been doing this for much longer and have much greater skill at evaluating, questions like this. So again, I think if there's that widespread disagreement amongst the experts, then the thing for us to do is to suspend judgment. We're not in a position to have a rational belief on the topic yet. And that's true whether or not we've done our own research. And so here too, doing your own research, again, you may be interested and you may want to do that, and that could be great, but it's not going to change which attitude is justified for you. So again, that's one of the reasons why I think you're not required to do it, because it's not going to change anything. You should be believing in line with the experts. If they agree, believe what they agree. If it's really, divided and there's rampant disagreement, then it's not time, there's not time to have a justified view on the matter yet.
The point that I see that is challenging me until now is that we define the experts as being the one that knows more, know more. And then when we take the case of science, for example, for the climate change, then we bring in the idea of the consensus of experts. And maybe in science, that's the case. There is a consensus on experts, but maybe in many other topics, the consensus is only based of experts is based on certification. So you need to have a certain certification in order to become an expert. And so I see that kind of it separates the concept of experts that we use to, that you define in the book as people that know, and the experts that we actually have. So there is an assumption that the people that we find in consensus about different topics are actually the one that know more about the topic, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could say, maybe this helps. Because if we put it in terms of knowledge, I guess that kind of presumes that they're at least getting a lot of the stuff right. And it could be that maybe in some fields that it's really hard, and so even the experts. I think even the experts in some fields might not be right all that often, because it's such a hard field to get answers in. But even if we take back the knowledge claim and just think about those other factors that feature into your epistemic position, right? There are people who have much more evidence of whether it's on climate change or quantum mechanics or say immigration policy, whatever the topic. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we think like, okay, maybe I've thought about it a little bit, but I know that there are people who have dedicated their life to this question, right? So they are far more well-read. They have all kinds of information that I haven't looked at, and they're better trained at evaluating that information, right? They know how to interpret information. They know how to evaluate these different pieces of evidence that they're bringing together, often from like different fields when the question kind of overlaps different disciplines. And so there's a whole set of like skills and information that you know, when I'm not an expert, I can recognize that like I'm lacking that. So I mean, again, it could be that, say, you know, let's just take the climate science. It could be that we have a discipline where there's overwhelming consensus amongst the certified experts, and it could be that they happen to be wrong. But I think even if they happen to be wrong, they're still experts in my sense, and that they have a privileged epistemic position. If we're trying to answer that question, we're better off going with their answer. Again, that's no guarantee that they're right, but they have a much higher chance of being right than I do, because my evidence is much more limited. My time on the matter is much more restrained. My abilities are much smaller in terms of like dealing with this evidence. And so if I want to get the answer right, again, the better plan is to go with the expert view. Again, that's no guarantee. I mean, there's no guarantees, and there's no guarantees for any of this. But I mean, I think the goal of the thesis of the book is just like that's an okay kind of like intellectual policy to take. I'm going to rely on someone who has this, you know, these credentials, these qualifications that I don't have. That's my better path to success, even if it's still, you know, a fallible path.
In the book, I was very surprised to see that the positive argument is one chapter or out of 10, and it's and then it's answering objections. And what I liked is I saw the argument, which is short, and then I was like, but did you think about this? And then, of course, you did. And then the next chapter was the second thing. So it's just me getting wrestled out of my arguments one after the other, my objection. But so can you then just go through the argument that you have, the positive ones, so that everybody's clear on like, okay, that's what you meant.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's two kind of tracks. One we've kind of stated already with regard to the consensus, which is doing your own inquiry or thinking for yourself is not going to change what it's rational for you to believe. Because again, what you should believe is, you know, what the expert community believes. If they have a consensus view, and if they don't, you should suspend judgment. And so the argument there is that if it's not going to change anything, if it's not going to change what it's rational for you to believe, you're free to do it, and it could be an okay thing to do, but there's not a requirement for you to do it, because it's not going to change. You're not going to end up in a place where there's a different belief that's rational for you to have. So that was one path. The other argument is just, you know, we kind of touched on it a little bit too, but you know, our intellectual goals are to, you know, believe truths and to not believe falsehoods. And if you really want to follow those goals, or, you know, to achieve that, deferring to someone who's in a better position to answer your question than you are looks like a better way of securing those goals than thinking for it for yourself. So if you have a better option to fulfill your goals, it certainly doesn't seem wrong to go with the better option. I mean, if you want to believe truths and this is the better option, it definitely doesn't seem like you are required to take an inferior option. You know, so in some sense that second argument there could be used for a stronger conclusion than what I give in the book, which is that we have some sort of intellectual obligation or requirement to defer to other people. And I don't go that far in the book, but I just think, look, if this is a better path, then surely it's okay to take the better path. So yeah, those are the two kind of like foundational arguments. But yeah, I mean, the book is mostly answering objections, because I think this is one of those cases where there's more what about this kind of like responses than there are to get things going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I still believe that it's very a succinct argument for what it's trying to prove. Because as you said, the scope is not as shocking as when we read the title, but the scope is still quite strong, because you still need to prove that that basically we have less chance of attaining truth if we do it ourselves for many topics. And the topics where actually we think, well, there is space for me to think about free will and causation and whatever, we're going to see that we we should just suspend judgment, basically. So that's still a strong conclusion, I believe.
Yeah. Well, so part of that comes from, doing a lot of teaching, and, so I'll teach intro to philosophy, and every once in a while, after spending, 2 weeks on free will, I'll have a student, come to me and say something like, guess what? I figured out what free will is. And I think like, I'm sorry. No, you have not. I appreciate that you've thought about it, right? That's the goal of the class, is to be wrestling with these arguments for yourself. But again, you've thought about it for 2 weeks, and you've read, at most 4 articles over those 2 weeks. Like, that this has been a debate amongst people who are much smarter than you, much more informed than you, for hundreds, thousands of years, and they're still trying to figure it out. They still have nothing like a consensus view. How amazing and miraculous would it be if, your first look at this for 2 weeks, you've come to like the conclusion on what free will is. But I think it's easy to see that sounds kind of silly in that context, but that's really what it is like, analogous to lots of these questions that we have in our life. Even if we have had a much more prolonged, research interest, it's still tiny compared to what experts in the field have done and the kind of work that they've put in, the kind of information that they have. And so for the same reason, I think, look, it's a good thing to engage in that research, to think about things for yourself, but in the end, you should be deferring to the experts.
And since we're on the internet, I have 2 terms that are using online heavily. There's the 2022 Word of the Year by Webster, which is gaslighting. I don't know if you know about this one. It's the manipulation of someone into questioning their perception of reality. And the second one is gatekeeping, which actually means many things, but it refers to the practice of controlling access to something. And so when I read this, it's the internet. I'm sure it's going to come up. How is the conclusion not gaslighting, trying to tell people, well, actually trust the experts because you cannot think for yourself, or gatekeeping of, well, it's just like the scientists or the experts have all the answers and they just drop it by drops to you. How would you answer to that?
Good. 2 good questions. I'll do them separately. So gatekeeping, I don't talk at all about in the book. Gaslighting a little bit, but I can see there being a gatekeeping worry if the view was this issue is for the experts. You shouldn't come over here at all. You shouldn't look at this. You shouldn't think about it. This is not for you at all. And I think that's not right either, right? So I think, look, we should think about what you want to think about. If there's a question that you want to dig into and read about, think about, collect evidence about, then you should do it. It's not for the experts only, right? So if you're interested in climate change, you should look into climate change. If you're interested in free will, you should read about free will. So, I think someone could take the argument from the book and use it to kind of like bolster a gatekeeping view, right? Which is to say, look, we're better off at this. You stay out, and we don't need you meddling over here in our domain. But that's not how I would take the view. I think, again, the thesis of the book is just that it's okay not to wander into those domains, not that there's like a prohibition against wandering into those domains. And and we can see, like, oftentimes there have been people from outside of a domain or outside the kind of like certified experts who have found some insight within that other domain. And so there is good reason for people to be thinking about issues that they perhaps lack expertise in. I think there's a caution in terms of we shouldn't go with those views right away, at least when they're against the expert consensus. But I wouldn't want to encourage or endorse a view that said keep out, don't look at what we're doing over here. This is our evidence. It's not for you. That's not, that I would caution against. And that, gaslighting comes up a little bit in the chapter on the vulnerability objection, because one worry you could have about the view is if you are going to defer to an expert, there's, not all experts are good characters, and some of them can, abuse your trust, and some of them can manipulate you in virtue of you trusting them. And so I think there is a vulnerability in trusting experts. But I don't think you can, I don't think that there's, you avoid that vulnerability by thinking for yourself. Thinking for yourself is also fallible. Thinking for yourself is still the kind of thing where you can get it wrong. So part of what I wanted to say is that, gaslighting obviously isn't a good thing to do, but there's a reason why it unfortunately works. It can work because the person who's being gaslit is often following their evidence. They are believing reasonably because they're being manipulated by someone who they have good reason to trust. And so again, I don't in any way want to condone the practices of gaslighting, but there's a reason why they work, because they're manipulating someone who is believing rationally. In the same way, in a less charged case, the same way that a surprise party works because the person whose birthday or the person whose party it is following their reasons. They have great reasons to think that nothing's happening and that their friends aren't all getting together, and that's why the surprise works.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that helps clarify. So I think both those worries are there in the neighborhood, but I don't think that the thesis of the book or the argument of the book works to sort of enforce either of those practices.
Yeah. No, I think, it makes sense. I didn't take it this way. I didn't see it as gaslighting and so on. But since we're on the internet, I want to avoid you the fire of hell that that awaits some of us. Okay, very good. So in terms of objections, the first objection was the autonomy one, and it's that thinking for ourselves is a condition for our intellectual autonomy. And so you don't think that it's the case. Why?
Yeah, good. So, I think it's a little tricky because it's hard to pin down what exactly our intellectual autonomy is. And so one thing that I'd want to push back on is the idea, not saying that you were saying this, but the idea, I think it's easy to conflate autonomy with individualism. And so to think that intellectual autonomy is this kind of do it all yourself, being in charge of everything yourself. And I don't think that's the picture of autonomy. So when we think just about autonomy more generally, we don't think of the hermit as the paradigm of autonomy, the person who relies on no one else. Rather, autonomous agents are still can be very interdependent, to live in communities, to rely on other people. In fact, you might think that they're more autonomous. They have more control over their lives in virtue of being, immersed into this social context. So similarly, when it comes to our intellectual realm, I think we got to be careful not to confuse autonomy with do-it-yourselfism. So there's a view that we think that, oh, if you're autonomous, you better be coming to all your own conclusions. You better be doing all the reasoning yourself. And for this, for the same reason that we don't think you need to be, making all your own clothes and making all your own food to be an autonomous social individual, I think it's perfectly fine. In fact, it helps enhance our autonomy intellectually to be more, socially embedded, reliant people who use the resources of the people who are around us. Mm-hmm. So, in the end of that chapter, I try to advance a view where I think of epistemic autonomy as a kind of intellectual virtue. So a way of a good character trait for inquirers. And on my view, the intellectually autonomous person is someone who's a good executive manager of their inquiry. So they make good decisions in terms of how they ought to go about answering questions. So, as we started out our conversation, we talked about, there are two kind of broad paths of answering questions. You can think about it for yourself, get the evidence yourself, evaluate it for yourself, or you can defer to someone else. And so the way I think of an autonomous, intellectually autonomous person is someone who makes good choices with regard to those decisions. Which questions is it better for you to think about for yourself? Which questions is it better for you to defer to someone else who's more knowledgeable about the topic than you are? And so the autonomous person isn't the person who just does everything themselves. They're the person who is a good executive manager, and they figure out what the best way is to kind of like divide up their intellectual projects, and when to rely on others, and when relying on others is actually the better policy than thinking about it for themselves.
Yeah, and I think that there is so many things that we don't realize we differ, because when I take the plane, I defer to the pilot, and when I take the plane, I also hope that the calculations made by the mathematicians are solid, and that the theorems that have been found are. I never checked the theorems that Thales was really defining, and so on. All of them, at least. So there are many things that we differ. What I really appreciated, I mean, this is the concept of the epistemic commons, right? There is this huge amount of knowledge that we have in the world that used to be maybe in one library, but now it's all over the world. It's way too much compared to what we can learn in a lifetime. So we basically cannot be, I don't remember the term used, but like a hermit thinker. We cannot just be somewhere in the mountains thinking about stuff.
Okay, I think that's an intellectual maverick, someone who's just like, I'm gonna do it all on my own. There's no need to rely on anyone else. Again, that person's going to end up with a far fewer true beliefs, and they're going to be prone to many more errors. So, I mean, I think the real way to be a curious person is to rely on other people. There's so many more questions that you can answer. There's such a fuller picture of the world that you can get when you don't just do it all yourself, starting from square one on all these issues and all these questions, but you are relying on all the intellectual work that's come before you, all the intellectual work that's being done, all around the world at all the time.
I think that leads us to the weird conclusion to say that most of us nowadays, simply by existing and trusting other people that have thought about things, are much more intelligent. If intelligence is based on how many truths do we access compared to falsities, then like Aristotle, that spent his life learning things. He was very intelligent, but of course he had access to less truths than we do. Is that right?
I mean, we definitely have a big advantage over people from history, right? We have the benefit of them having all come ahead of us and have them having made their discoveries that we can build on top of. I mean, if we had to start any research program over at any given generation, we'd be constantly, we wouldn't be able to make much progress, but our ability to continually build on, what we found out from the past puts us at a huge advantage. I think, the picture of the world that we have access to at this point in time is, the richest picture of the world that we've had yet. It's great. It's a great privilege to be a part of it. I mean, that's no knock on Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle did so much more with what he had, so I'd still put him high up in terms of a quality of inquirer. But we have the benefit of having, thousands of years of people working on these other questions as well.
And that leads me directly to kind of the close-up of this thinking, because even though this is the case because we access more truths, that's a definition of intelligence that we define. Because if Aristotle would come to me and I would have the same information that he has, I think he would overpower me in terms of reasoning and curiosity and so on.
Right.
By 1,000 miles. Yeah. And so this is where I think there is a difference it's kind of a category mistake to compare the access to truths and falsities and capabilities that we have, intellectual capacities to make sense of the world on our own, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you can have, you can have a fantastic intellectual character, but not be in a very friendly intellectual environment. And in which case it doesn't pay off nearly so great. And you can have a pretty terrible intellectual character, but be in a very rich intellectual environment and just, almost against your will, be given all kinds of truths. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it would be a mistake just to like calculate, a proportion of truths over falsehoods in one's head. And, on the basis of that, ascribe some sort of like, intellectual agent score or something like that, because I do think a lot more goes into it. And yeah, certainly one's intellectual character is a big piece of that puzzle.
To go back to the autonomy objection, I think that we pushed it a bit further here, because on one side, I mean, once we say like the goal is accessing truth and avoiding falsities, then we could not think at all for ourselves and it would be still okay. But we would still miss out on a lot of things that maybe we can get closer to Aristotle, who was false on many things, but still there is some characteristics that we can develop through that. It just, we don't have to, because other people are doing it. It's better if we do, basically, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that's my view. So I mean, I do think, like, in terms of intellectual character, there's a lot of intellectual character that you don't develop if you're not engaged in inquiry yourself, right? So if you're not doing the thinking, you're not going to develop your own intellectual perseverance. You're not going to, fight through obstacles that you encounter in inquiry. And those are good things to get. Like, it's good to be intellectually virtuous. It's good to have a more, robust, well-rounded intellectual character. So I mean, I think that's better. And that, that's why I think it is better, in epistemically better to be engaged in thinking for yourself. Like, that's why I want my students to think for themselves. I want them to be engaged with the readings and the arguments, to be thinking through them for themselves. Again, not because they're going to get to the truth necessarily on their own, but because they're going to cultivate an intellectual character that's going to serve them well. So I do think that's better. I just don't think it's required. So I mean, that's kind of we can be good enough as intellectual agents, even if we don't develop that intellectual character. And part of the reason perhaps is because we have the good fortune of having this kind of great intellectual resources available to us. If things were different and we didn't have those intellectual resources, maybe there'd be more on each of us to do on our own. But that's not the situation that we find ourselves in. So part of the idea is I think philosophers often tend to want to make everyone else philosophers too, and so it's like everyone should be a philosopher. And I think there's something great about philosophy and thinking about philosophical questions. But I also want to say, like, look, there's nothing wrong intellectually with someone's life who wants to live it in a different way, and they want to do something else. There's different projects that they want to engage in. That's fine. Like, they're not at an intellectual, even if it's not they're doing their intellectual best, it's still okay.
I take the opportunity to challenge this because I want everybody to to learn philosophy. But no, basically, I thought about this, and I had for years a problem, which is I believe that people have some kind of epistemic duty. Our beliefs are connected to our actions. And I think that if you have wrong beliefs, then you have wrong actions. And I think we can see this with like polarization and all these things. Like, it's very important where our beliefs come from. And so some part of me is like, but we need to do so much more. I'm kind of ashamed of the position because it's also very elitist, I think. And then when I think about it, I'm like, wow, people do what they can. And nobody has this obligation. But even though I believe that, I will argue against it. So I think that we all need a worldview. We need to have a possibility to know how to make sense of the world. And so a justified worldview, it requires some kind of understanding. For example, what we can know in the world, the limits of our reason. That's something that epistemology does. What composes our world at the most basic level, which is metaphysics, how to act towards others with ethics, and how we can make sense of the world through logic, which is logically possible. So based on this, we need to study philosophy, all of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's even grant you that we all need to have a worldview. I mean, I guess I'm not sure about that, but let's even grant that, like with that we have to have a worldview. I mean, I definitely agree that our beliefs are important. They shape our actions. They affect each other, and so we should care deeply about what's going on in our heads. Um, the place I'd push back is that caring deeply about what's going on in our heads isn't incompatible with deference. In fact, the two can go hand in hand. Like, it could be because I care so deeply about having a good worldview, about making sure that my beliefs are such that it's going to allow me to engage in productive ways in the world, to treat other people the right way. Um, it could be for those very reasons that I defer to someone else who's better at answering these questions about what reality is like at its fundamental level, or which things have value over other things. And so I do agree that there would, perhaps there's a problem if you're like, I don't care about any of these questions. But caring about the questions is still compatible with deferring to other people or relying on what they've come to. So I mean, I don't think caring about the question requires you to be engaged with it yourself. I mean, saying that too. I mean, I like you, I still feel uncomfortable sometimes saying something, because I too think, look, these are great questions, and they're great questions to wrestle with, and I would love it for everyone to wrestle with them. So I mean, I think like they are questions that make your life better to wrestle with. It's just okay not to. I mean, one quick anecdote, like my daughter in school, she heard they were talking about philosophy and Socrates, and she came home after, and she said, "So this Socrates guy said that the unexamined life is not worth living." I'm like, "Yeah," and she's like, "That sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it?" And I was like, "Well, yeah. I mean, that does sound kind of harsh. Like I'm team the examined life is a better life, and it's a good one, and I recommend it to you. But like the unexamined one, like not worth living, seems a little bit too strong."
That shows how even kids have sometimes better intuitions than people interested in philosophy. We just bask too long in our own debates, and then it's like, we couldn't live without this.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, and so if the worldview, we can still live without philosophy and developing a worldview. I want to bring you to God, because I had on the podcast Professor Liz Jackson. I don't know if you know her.
Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And so I had her on the podcast, and she has a channel, and she put a video about the rationality of believing or not believing in God. And I went in the comment and I challenged her, saying that, well, there is no consensus currently on the existence or not of God. And most of us also haven't done the work to support our belief or non-belief in God. It's mostly or many of us have just defined it through the environment that we have, or so on. And so I asked her, what do you think? And I also said that I read your book. And so I put you directly in contact with her.
Okay.
And so she said that first, it's not obvious that there is a clearly identifiable expert class for a consensus here. So she even, it's not only that there's no consensus, so we should be agnostic, is the concept of consensus doesn't even apply for religious belief, in our opinion. And the second argument was that the evidence that we can have for the existence of God is not just technical or scientific, but also personal experience, moral reflection, background worldview, and so on. So basically, she said it's fine for some people to be agnostic, but for the ones that don't want, it's still rational to be theist or atheist. What do you think?
Interesting. Yeah. So I agree. I take the question of God's existence to be one of those that is very contentious, and that there's not a consensus view. I agree too that it's like a hard question is, who are the relevant experts, or who's in the best epistemic position to answer that question. Some people say, oh, it's the people in the religious community. They have the expertise. They've been dealing with these questions the most. Some say it's philosophers of religion. some, along with what you said, it could be people who have had a religious experience, because that religious experience is such a vivid thing that it puts them in a unique position to be an expert without the kind of credentialing that we were talking about earlier. So I guess I think two things, but I mean, I think that makes the question harder, more complicated rather than less complicated. So I mean, I think we should suspend judgment about who the relevant experts are. And depending upon how we classify who those relevant experts are, we might get different answers in terms of like what the consensus is or which way it points. So I think this kind of like meta confusion about who even is positioned the best to answer this question, trickles down our skepticism to the question of God's existence as well. We can't even figure out, who to turn to for help in terms of figuring out this question. And where we turn is going to give us different answers, and none of those answers are really, clearly agreed upon. And so, yeah, I mean, my disagreement view has it that we should be suspending judgment on that question. I mean, to say something a little more friendly, that's less, down or skeptical maybe, is, I mean, I do think that, I'm talking about epistemic justification, and I do think that's a pretty high standard. It's a high standard to meet. And so saying that, beliefs on a certain question don't meet the standard of being epistemically justified is not to say that they're terrible beliefs, or that, you have to, no one should have them, or that you're being silly and irresponsible if you have them. They just lack a certain status that I think is a really important status. And so I'm not sure in your conversation with Liz, if you were talking, exclusively about epistemic justification, because I know she does work on other kinds of reasons as well. And so I would want to just say that, for the book and for my view, the kind of the class of reasons that I'm concerned with are, purely these epistemic reasons. And I don't really have anything to say about whether there might be other kinds of reasons, whether there might be practical reasons or prudential reasons. Maybe, but that's not the kind of area where I've been focused and thinking about.
The second challenge is, well, you said it's not. I think maybe you're going to invoke like pragmatic reasons on this question, but what should we do then when we are forced to take a position? Because, for example, in politics, when we have votations, maybe there is no consensus on the topic. For many of them, that's the case. That's also why we try to ask the population what they think. What should we do then? Are we forced to come up with a conclusion, or should we simply vote blank?
Yeah. No, I think this is the hardest, most uncomfortable part of the view is, with any sort of view that has a skeptical consequence, is that, skeptical views have this kind of luxury in terms of like in our head, it's okay to be skeptical and just not have a view on it. But there's not that kind of like parallel in our practical lives, right? You can't just like suspend your actions. Like you have to do something. Like, so in the case of like voting, you're either voting or you're not voting. There's no like, I'm going to suspend on voting. And if you're voting for candidate A or candidate B. You can't like, well, I'm going to suspend between those two. And so there is a disconnect because, our intellectual lives afford us this option of suspension of judgment that our practical lives don't. And so, in cases where, the epistemological view has the conclusion we should be suspending judgment, or suspension of judgment is the rational attitude to have, a natural worry is, well, I still got to live my life. I still have to, decide whether I should do this thing or not do this thing. And what kind of advice can you give me? So here's the really unsatisfying thing that you might not like, which is that I'm going to stay in my lane and I'm only concerned about the epistemological states of affairs. So, what I have expertise in is whether your beliefs have this certain status, epistemic justification. And so I think there's good reasons to think that beliefs in a lot of domains where there's this controversy don't have that status. That invites this question, well, how should I live my life? Or, what should I do? Those are hard questions, but also not epistemological questions, like questions that I think like the epistemologist isn't equipped to give an answer to, we're going to need to rely on someone who's thought, whether it's in the field of ethics or in the field of pragmatics or decision theory, there's going to be, perhaps there'll be a principle there that we can appeal to. I don't think we get it from epistemology. So, I mean, that's kind of like, that's the official stamp. I guess if I was forced to give an answer, because that's too unsatisfying, I think like, look, perhaps epistemic justification isn't a status that your belief has, but things often still strike you a certain way, right? And you still have, you still see things a certain way, even if believing that that's the way they are isn't justified, given what you know about the controversy about the issue. And it at least seems to me like, living your life in accordance with how things seem to you and how things appear to you is, a good path forward. But, I just, put as a caveat, don't think along the way that you're epistemically justified in believing that you're right. So, you gotta do something, probably the best thing to do is to do what seems right to you, but keeping in mind, when the matter is suitably contentious, you're not epistemically justified in thinking that you're correct.
I heard you on another podcast talk about the example of if you arrive at a fork in a road and it's like 50-50, at some point you have pragmatic reasons and you say, well, I'm going right, but actually I'm not justified. I don't know. I kind of like take a guess. And that would be more or less the same, you would say, as a voting situation. Or do you see it a bit differently? Because if you rely on intuition or like what sounds best for us, but there's no epistemic justification, well, it's more a gut decision than something rational, is it?
Well, it's at least lacking the epistemic reasons that would give you a justified belief. But yeah, I take it that that the voting situation is often unlike the fork in the road situation. Like if we set up the fork in the road situation where it's like really 50-50, often, when we're faced with an election or something like that, things don't strike us quite like that, right? Things strike us like, look, this candidate over here seems to have a lot more going for them than the other candidate. I can see how this policy works. This policy looks really good to my eyes. Again, you can do all that while acknowledging, look, this is all super contentious and there's lots of experts who are disagreeing all over the map. But again, this is an epistemology, so there's the kind of like take this for a grain of salt. But part of the democratic election is like, look, where do you see things? How do you see things? And like your vote should reflect how you see things. And so, I think often you're going to see things in a certain way, like in favor of a certain candidate. And so it seems plausible that that's the way you should vote. That's the way you should be engaged. It's good to vote. It's good to be engaged, even if, along the way, you aren't epistemically justified in thinking this was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Or we should all study philosophy because we have a duty to do it for a coherent and justified worldview. Yeah, no, I'm just joking.
Yeah. Well, that makes things worse, though. Is I think I think it's good to study philosophy, but I don't think you end up getting that when you do philosophy either, right? Because once the deeper you get into studying philosophy, I think the more confusing things look like, right? You find out that there's much more, there's more nuance than what you thought. There's more alternative perspectives and positions than what you thought, and they have better arguments than what you were thinking. And so like the picture often gets muddier the deeper you get in. Again, that could still be better because you're appreciating the muddiness that's actually there in the world. But I think like we don't get a clear picture just by doing more philosophy. Not that you were saying that either, but just throw that in there.
Yeah, no, for sure. We just like the pain of seeing certainty disappearing. And so last question, because I also wanted to have your opinion on that. So basically with AI now progressing, maybe If we reach AGI and the tools become better than experts, would you say we have some kind of duty to just outsource everything to the machine, the thinking, and saying like, you know better than me, tell me what to do?
Yeah, well, there's certain things that I think we can feel fairly confident that AI won't be so good at. Like, I don't know that incorporating values is going to be something that will happen. Maybe. I don't feel super confident about saying anything about AI, with one possible exception. Like, I don't see a lot of the hesitation that people have in terms of deferring to AI seems misplaced to me. So a lot of the reasons people give why they're apprehensive to defer to AI seems to apply equally well to human experts, right? Mm-hmm. So you can hear the kind of the complaint or the worry that, like, I don't understand how it got here. Like, I don't understand the process that led to this conclusion. Right. But that's often true of experts as well, right? So when you defer to the climate scientists, you often don't understand the process that led to their output. Like, you understand their output and what their testimony was, but you don't fully understand the process that got there. So there's this kind of like black box phenomenon of like, look, the reasoning of the expert's opaque, the reasoning of the AI is often opaque to us as well. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that would be a reason not to trust an AI. I think it perhaps is going to be more complicated and harder to determine when an AI is sufficiently capable of answering certain questions, right? So mm-hmm. There's no doubt, like, going back to those factors that influence one's epistemic position, there's no doubt that AI has a vastly superior body of evidence, right? It's drawing from far more data than any human mind can store, can manage in any way. So, like, there's one factor upon which, like, AI is going to always win by a lot. But when it comes to, like, evaluating that data or making, knowing which data is relevant and sorting through that, sometimes things can go really well. Sometimes we have no idea what's going on. And so I think there's at least an epistemic problem for us in terms of, like, what would it take for us to be confident or justifiably confident that the AI system is handling that data in an effective, reasonable way. I think, there's no reason to think we couldn't get there, but I think it could be a complicated mm-hmm. story. I don't think the fact that it's, not biological on its own would be a reason not to defer to it. So, the reasoning, for the conclusion in the book is just like, look, there are better ways of answering questions than others. It could be that the best way of answering questions involves not much biological processes at all. I don't think the biology is doing anything. It's just the question of whether we can get to the point that we have good reason to trust that the AI is the better way of answering the question than we are. And then, there's questions about checks and balances and how do we create suitable safeguards, and how do we, prevent ourselves from deferring to things that then lead to catastrophic problems. And yeah, I don't have good answers there, but I think there are interesting parallels between just AI and ordinary human experts that should cause us to at least be a little bit more hesitant to push back against the AIs.
Well, thank you so much. For people that are interested, there's your book, Why It's Okay Not to Think for Yourself. There are more objections that we could have tackled in this talk, so there's definitely more to explore. And I think you also have a website, or people can Google your name and find all the information. I will also add it in the links in the description so that they can check it out.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation.